Hello and welcome to this week's podcast. This week, I'm actually going to bring you hopefully 3 podcasts. I haven't finished them all yet, so it's a work in progress. But here in Australia, it is Gifted Awareness Week. And every year it's brought to us by the Australian Association for the Education of the Gifted and Talented. And so there's a bunch of stuff happening all around Australia in the different states. And in each state here, we have state gifted associations. So if you're one of our Australian listeners and you haven't already connected to your state association, this is a great week to do that. If you're one of our international listeners, hello and welcome. Be prepared for 3 really great podcast episodes this week. Now, the theme for this week is like minds. And I had a question recently from one of the listeners. And she said, Sophia, how do I tell grandparents about my child's gifted diagnosis? And that made me think, because for a while now, I have been wanting to do an episode for grandparents. And I've also been wanting to do an episode like for kids and just one from one parent to another. These are the things I wish I knew at that moment when my child was diagnosed. So this week we have 3 episodes, I hope, all being well. I obviously haven't finished them yet. Today's episode, from one parent to another, the 5 things I wish I knew in that moment that my child was diagnosed gifted. And I've limited this to 5 things because I could be here all week talking about the things I wish I had known. But I'm going to go for the top 5. And hopefully tomorrow I will share with you an episode for grandparents where I'm actually interviewing our grandparents. Nana and Pop get involved, which is great. And then a final episode for a week, fingers crossed, with my kids talking about giftedness. So this should be at least very interesting. And if you don't want to miss out on any of our episodes this week, you can subscribe at ourgiftedkids.com, which is where you can also find all of the show notes from this episode and lots of links that I have included to help you on this journey. So stay tuned and let's get this show rolling. Let's start with from one parent to another, the 5 things I wish I knew. Hi, I'm Sophia Elliott. As a parent of 3 gifted kids, I'm here to talk about all things gifted. Because I've been isolated and uncertain, and I felt like that parent, then I found peace of mind, support, and my community. This podcast is about sharing that journey, actually parenting gifted kids, and connecting with advice and support. So we have everything we need for every member of our family to thrive. This is the Our Gifted Kid podcast. Hello and welcome. However you have found us, welcome to this podcast. Maybe you came to us from our Instagram page or our Facebook page or group. However it is, thank you for joining us. This is an episode that I've been wanting to do for a little while, and it's just like from one parent to another parent. In that moment, where you have just had your child diagnosed as being gifted. Because that's like one of those pivotal life moments. When I look back at that moment, for us it was over 5 years ago, I'm just kind of like, oh my, the things that have changed. The journey we have been on in that 5-year period is immense. And yeah, there's some stuff I really wish I knew. So for us, my husband and I were sitting there. Maybe this is how it worked for you as well. We're in the psychologist's office. We're there for that feedback conversation after they've done the cognitive assessment, the IQ test. And they're going through the results. And our minds start to just kind of spin. You get all these different emotions. Largely just kind of like, well, what is this gifted thing? And what do these numbers really mean? And what does that mean for me as a parent? I remember driving home and my husband and I in the car just trying to make sense of it all. And I would 1 minute be laughing, in the next minute be crying, just kind of that slightly hysterical laughter that you get when you're kind of nervous, and then just kind of crying because it was just incredibly overwhelming. We were obviously going through a lot at that particular time, which caused us to go get that assessment. And it was so incredibly overwhelming. It was so overwhelming. I had no idea what we were getting into, none at all. And so I kind of think, what would I have wanted to know in that moment? If I could just have called a friend who really was already on this journey, what were the things that I needed at that moment? And so I'm hoping that this episode will answer that question. So let's just dive into it. I've tried to limit this to 5 things. I was brainstorming, thinking, what are the big things? And then I realized in the kind of Our Gifted Kids work I've been doing, we have a membership hub, and a part of that hub is this journey, these 5 steps. And then I'm like, oh my God, it's the 5 steps. These are the 5 things. And so it starts with understanding gifted. So in that moment, the first thing I would have said to myself is just breathe. Just breathe. It's going to be okay. It feels very overwhelming. There's lots of big emotions. Just feel those emotions. Let them in, let them out, cry, laugh, do whatever it is you need to do. Just give yourself that moment, because this is big. This may have answered a lot of questions for you. It may just be really overwhelming, but nonetheless, this is big. This is a big shift. You may also feel, either at this moment or in the time to come, grief. Because I think, well, I certainly felt when I became that parent for the first time, or the second or third time, we have all of these hopes. We have this vision. And inevitably that includes feeling as though we belong in the world, that our child will belong in the world. And when we get information and news that suggests that our child is different to what is considered mainstream or typical, I feel that can sort of ignite this sense of fear and grief that, oh my goodness, my child might have a really challenging time. My child might not fit in. My child might be different. And because we're human beings, we're naturally engineered over millennia to be a part of a group. And so when that sense of being a part of the group is challenged or dashed, we inevitably feel some fear and some grief. And so I just want to say that is totally okay to feel that way, because things have just shifted for you and for your child. Because I certainly felt grief. And then later on, you may even feel grief for yourself. And that is okay too. For the childhood that you may now understand through this different lens that you didn't before, just for some of the challenges and difficulty that you also had. And that fear because we don't want our kids to have those same challenges that we have. And then when you kind of get a name and a language for that, giftedness, neurodivergency, then we get to kind of process those things in a different way. And it's okay to feel all sorts of mixed emotions about that. So in the first instance, just breathe. Take your time to process this information. You will also, in the time to come, need to find your tribe. And if you're listening to this episode, welcome. You have found us. We are here. We can have these conversations because it is a journey that is different to most people. And you need to surround yourself in one way or another, whether it's online or in real life. Find this tribe that you can share this journey with, because there will be things to celebrate. There will be challenges ahead, and giftedness is so misunderstood that it can be hard to share those challenges and those celebrations with people who don't get it, because it's hard to share celebrations. People feel like you're bragging or bigging yourself up, and it's not it. It's just like, this is what my kid did. I want to share that because it's awesome. And we should be allowed to share and celebrate those great things. But also there are real challenges. And there's this massive misconception about giftedness that it's all easy, and it really isn't. So you need to find your people to share those challenges with as well. And the first thing I would have said to me in that moment is right, Sophia, we need to get a handle on what this gifted thing is all about. Because I spent the next couple of years trying to figure that out. And you can search online and you can find lists and lists of different traits and characteristics that gifted kids and adults will share. But for me, it wasn't enough. I was kind of like, well, hang on, but why? Why is there this group of people who share these similar traits and characteristics? And there just never seemed to be anything substantial enough that would answer that question for me, until I found the work of Gifted Research and Outreach, otherwise known as GROW. And they have actually done all this research about the gifted brain, and it's fascinating. And it's the first thing that you need to understand about giftedness is it's not just about doing well at school. It's not about getting A's. It's not even about just a high IQ. It's having a brain that is wired differently. And the research from GROW shows us that there are 6 different ways that brain is wired differently. And it answers many of the questions and challenges that we have as parents parenting gifted kids. That incredible sensitivity, that rage to learn, those big emotions, all of the different sensory sensitivities can be explained through this research that they have done and hopefully will be expanded on in the years to come. So number 1 is giftedness is about the brain being significantly different to what is typical. And I've done episodes on what neurodiversity is all about. I've also done an episode called Giftedness is More Than Just High IQ, and that can go into that in more detail. And I'll put those links in the show notes. So the psychologist has just told you your child is gifted. Now you've taken a few deep breaths. You know that it's actually because your child's brain is wired differently. And that encompasses not just a high IQ, but also these intense emotion and physical sensitivities that need to be taken into account as you parent and as your child goes through school. You know that it's okay to grieve and feel any of those big emotions that you have, and that you need to find your people. That's the beginning. The next step, number 2, is education is power. And this is number 2 because, as we've discussed in another episode, and I'm thinking primarily about the episode with Dr. Linda McGuinness, the principal of Dara School. We did an episode on what is gifted. And she talks about how when you meet the educational needs of the child, the behaviors disappear. And she sees this all the time. And because when your educational needs are not being met, as a child, you express that through your behavior. And you can have some very challenging, very scary behaviors. You can see that also through anxiety and depression. You can see that through being really challenging in the educational environment that they're in. So it's critical to know that, because the reality is, and this is another thing I'd wish I'd known in that moment, because I went from that meeting at the psychologist home and to the next day to talk to my child's school. And that was not successful. That was his first school. And thankfully, he got a great second school, but not everyone does even get a good second school. Many gifted kids, by the time they're 10 years old, have been to many schools, 2, 3, 4 schools. And the thing that you need to know is at the moment, and this is a problem not just in Australia, but in many parts of the world, we don't understand what gifted is. And that leads to problems in education and challenges and in all areas of life, because it's, as the research from Grow shows us, it's about acknowledging that because our brain is wired differently, that affects us wherever we go in life. From childhood through to adulthood, it affects our lived experience of the world. And they're even looking at ways that they think it's affecting physiology. So it's relevant to your teacher, your psychologist, your counselor, your doctor to be aware of this. But unfortunately, we don't have that level of knowledge. Now, if you're a parent of a gifted kid, the immediate concern is schooling. And the immediate challenge is whether or not anyone at that school gets gifted. And a lot of schools don't. And unfortunately, you see it in the leadership and you see it in the teachers. And even if you get a good teacher, if the leadership don't get it, that can make it a really big struggle. And part of the problem is when teachers go through training, there are very, very few universities who provide required learning around gifted kids. It might be one class. It might be, if you're lucky, one subject. More recently, some universities are bringing on whole subjects for teachers, which is obviously brilliant, but that's a recent thing, right? So we've got lots of teachers out there who are trying to do their very best under difficult circumstances. I mean, let's just look at the last few years. Teachers are hurting, and they're trying to do their best by the students in their classroom, but they have not been armed with the information they need to be able to identify gifted kids and to really know what those gifted kids need. And unless a teacher has done a master's in gifted education, or unless they've got some really great leadership leading the way, that knowledge might just not be there. And as a parent working with the school, that can come back at you as either a teacher who's desperately wanting to do the right thing by a child but feeling ill-equipped, or it might actually come back as a complete brick wall. And I think as a parent in this moment, it's important to know and acknowledge that, because armed with that information, I went back to my child's school and tried to have a conversation about what my child needed educationally. And I was met with a very angry, no, not angry, that's not quite right. I was met with a brick wall. I would actually say an obstinate brick wall. So there was no cooperation, there was no interest, there was no willingness to meet my child's needs. It was just kind of like, no, your child does not fit in this box. And they just couldn't cope with anything outside of that box. And for me, as a parent, I was kind of like, but you're the teachers, you're the school. You've got hundreds of kids, you're supposed to get this stuff. And it made me doubt myself and what the psychologist had said. Except I could see for myself from the behavior I was experiencing at home and how unhappy my child was. And I knew from what the psychologist said that my child needed these things. And so it was really difficult for me then as a parent to understand, well, why as a school and a teacher you weren't providing those things. And it's important for us to know as parents that it's because the knowledge is just not there. And it's not anyone's fault. It's just what we're dealing with. But as a parent, don't let that erode your sense of intuition. You have to trust your gut and what your child needs. You have to stand strong and advocate really hard. And that's a really important thing to know in that moment, because a gifted child needs an education that will challenge them. Research has shown that a gifted kid can get through an entire school year and for 80% of it not have learnt anything. That's huge. And they need to learn because especially in primary years, and this is the other myth, there is no point at which it's not okay to meet these needs. And there's an episode there from Dr. Geraldine Townsend that I did about self-concept. And she talks about how in those very early years, like the first years of schooling, if a child is getting this negative feedback because they're perceived as being naughty because their needs aren't getting met because they're gifted, well, then they start to perceive themselves as a naughty child, and that affects their self-concept. So we need to be onto this. We need to be onto it early and straight away. At every age, a gifted child needs those accommodations. They need the education that will provide a challenge for them. Because throughout life, throughout primary years, that challenge that is they're learning how to learn. They're learning to make mistakes. They're learning how to ask questions. They're learning how to ask for help. And if you don't learn that in primary school, that can leave you in a very difficult position when you get to high school. And even worse if you go on to further studies. And that is a classic gifted scenario. There's a great YouTube video called James and Susie, which I'll put in the show notes, which explains that beautifully. It's just short. And you will watch that and you'll be like, oh my goodness, all primary age gifted kids need appropriate challenge. So we get what gifted is. We know we're going to have some big feelings about that. We know we need to find our people. We know we need to find an appropriate education. And we know that might be hard. In fact, it's probably going to be hard. I'd like to say things are getting better. I think things are getting better. But don't be put off if you are sitting there as a parent going, like talking to a brick wall when you go to your teacher, your school. That's just because they don't have the knowledge and it's not their fault. It's just the way things are. My advice is find people who do get it. And I think it's also really important is to know that the higher percentile your child came back in that assessment, the more extreme accommodations they're going to need. So a gifted kid is considered, and there are a million different kind of definitions, but let's just go with the top 10%. So the 90th percentile and up in terms of a full scale IQ or a general ability index. But there's a big difference between the 90th percentile, say the 95th to 98th percentile, the 98th to 99th percentile, and the 99.9 percentile. There's actually big gaps there. So a gifted child in the 90th percentile at a school with accommodations and a bit of acceleration will potentially do really great. As you approach the 99.9 percentile, that child needs significant accommodations, potentially significant acceleration. Like that child is whole standard deviations away. So the higher that percentile goes up in terms of full scale IQ and general ability index, the more accommodations that child needs, the more advocating you're going to need to do as a parent. So education is really important. So in that moment, I felt really overwhelmed. I just got this big number back and I felt this enormous pressure to parent a child with this massive potential and a child with a massive rage to learn. And you know what they're like? They're like sponges. They just consume everything. Books, books, books. They just want knowledge and learning. And so the temptation is to imagine that's like a bucket. It's just to keep pouring stuff into that bucket. Do more, stuff. But what I have learned and what I wish I had known then, because I put myself through an enormous amount of stress trying to get this right, was, yeah, they want to learn. Yeah, we need to support them in their learning. But actually, there's a balance. So I have one of my children in particular has a very intense area of interest in like the sciences. And so the temptation there is to just keep filling that bucket with science stuff. However, we need balanced children because we want them to become balanced adults. We want them to have a depth of lived experiences and experiences growing up. And if my child who loves science only ever experiences those sciencey things, then they have missed out on a wealth of lived experiences through their childhood. And it was actually a psychologist that I was talking to many years ago who kind of said, if you have a look at those people who are exceptional at a young age and just do that thing, whether it's sports or whether it's, music or whatever that might be. And if you have a look at them as an adult, often they're not still doing the thing as an adult. And that's because growing up, they didn't have that wide variety of experiences. It was just very narrow in that one field of expertise. And so when they became older, they just kind of lacked the well-roundedness that a variety of experiences would have given them. And that psychologist also said, if you consider this example, say the child is really good at AFL, football. Say the child's really good at football. Or then, that child might train a few times a week. They might have a game on the weekend. But you wouldn't do football 24/7. You wouldn't wake up every morning and do football. You wouldn't do football all day, all afternoon, all night. There needs to be something else in that life. That child needs to go to school and do maths and English. That child needs to perhaps, it has an interest in music, join scouts and develop social skills. So even that child who's really great at football needs a breadth of experience. And so I've deliberately used that sporting analogy because I think it gets our head out of what can be very academic for our gifted kids. So likewise, my child does not need science 24/7. We often actually, that child's a part of the astronomical society here where we live, and we take them to a monthly lecture because, that's their interest. We often buy books for science, and we will support that child in pursuing that interest in science and getting depth in various interests. But we also support that child in other ways. They go to scouts because that gets the opportunity for leadership and social skills, as well as being outdoors. There's a whole bunch of different things. Skateboarding is something we also pursue because it's a great opportunity for growth mindset. You've got to practice, practice, practice. There's also a different community around that. We also do different things from time to time. As a family, we like to go camping and forest walks in the winter. We go down to the beach in summer. So it's about a variety of experiences and being balanced. So if I could go back to myself 5 years ago and just say, relax. Yes, support their interests, but don't freak out about it. Yes, you need to get their needs met at school. That's going to be hard, but you can do it. But don't feel like you have to fill this bucket up with science 24/7. It's okay. They're kids. They need to play. They need to make a mess. They need to learn how to cook. All these other things in life are as valuable as that science thing. That child has a science brain. They're going to be doing science their lifetime, but give them a full and rich childhood of a variety of experiences. Because I think that would have allowed me to more quickly just chill out a bit and kind of go, you know what? Yes, my child is gifted, but they're still a kid and they got to play and they got to be a kid and get messy and ride a bike and ride a skateboard. And all those things are every bit as important as reading the science book and going to the science thing. And I think that's a really important perspective because in this rage to learn with this amazing potential in some areas that some of our kids have, we can get very stressed, I think, about filling that need. And I think that just enabled me just to relax a little bit. So also in that moment, I would have wanted to know that gifted children are also as likely to also have challenges in other areas. So it's called being twice exceptional. Just because a child's gifted does not mean that they're not going to have other challenges, because actually what we see is these things coming together. So a gifted child may well have ADHD, ASD, or autism, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, dyslexia, all sorts of challenges, highly anxious, prone to existential depression or crises, all sorts of mental health challenges. So be mindful of that. As a parent, over the next few years, keep an eye out for what those things might be, because we can get worried about labels, and that's fair. However, what labels give us is a language to understand. And with a label comes with the ability to support those aspects of that child. So don't be afraid of the labels, is what I would say. Don't be afraid of seeking out those understandings. I mean, you can share the labels with whoever you want, but I would say you need to know so you can support those areas of challenge. And I would actually go so far to say is your child needs to know too, because they need to know the way that they work and what these things are called and what they mean and the ways that they can support themselves in those areas of challenge and weakness. And I would also say, and this is sort of about the family and looking ahead to the future, is parenting gifted kids is hard. And I did a blog, it's called Is Parenting Gifted Kids Harder or Just Hard? So I'll put that in the show notes as well, because the reality is, yeah, it is. So our gifted kids are asynchronous in their development, which means that they may be ahead of their same age peers in some areas, they may be the same in others, and they may be behind in development in others. And how this often manifests is some really intense emotions. Social and emotional stuff can be really big and challenging for gifted kids. So as a parent, we need to take on that information and accommodate the way we parent to adjust our expectations of them. And that will make it easier for them and easier for you. So for example, when I was starting off in life as a parent, I had this wonderful vision of us all sitting at the dinner table eating dinner. It wasn't something we did well when I was growing up. And I'm like, that's something I want to achieve as a parent. And we do that, except I have modified my expectations of my children. So what sitting down at the dinner table looks like for us is my husband and I sit there. I have dinner deconstructed because we've all got various sensory issues with food. My kids sometimes like crunchy things, don't eat this, do eat that. So I tend to deconstruct dinner. So for example, what does that mean? Say we're having bolognese. Well, I would have the pasta separate to the pasta sauce, separate to the cheese. Or if we're doing like tacos, I'll have the taco shells. I would have, the salad separate, the cheese separate, so that people can select the things that they will eat and eat them with minimal fuss, but still trying to get that variety for everyone. So I have a deconstructed dinner. This is my latest. It's been working. I've been doing this for a while. We sit down. Now my kids struggle to sit still. And that is a part of their brain wiring. To expect them to just sit there and eat everything on their plate is unrealistic, because they have texture sensitivities and issues with food. So I have adjusted my expectation. I provide my little deconstructed buffet of food. And so they eat what they can accommodate in terms of the sensory needs. But I also would not expect them just to sit in the chair still. One day they might, one day they may never not, may never, but it's okay. So there's a fair degree of wiggling We sometimes have a wiggle seat that goes on and off the chairs. There'll be a fair degree of hopping up, wiggling, getting a drink, and then we just have to, redirect them back, right? Come on, back to the table. But that hopping up and down is what they kind of need to do to be able to kind of be present at the table. They can't just sit still. And for me as a parent, if I wanted to try and force the eating everything and the sitting still, every single mealtime would be a disaster, would end in tragedy. And it wouldn't be good for them and it wouldn't be good for me. It's an unrealistic expectation. So that's what I mean about adjusting our expectations of our parenting and schooling, about what our kids can actually do because of this asynchronous development, because of the way that they're more intense, experiencing the world. So as a parent, that's an extra load. And it's important for you to know that it's a tough gig parenting gifted kids, especially because of this asynchronous development regarding emotional regulation, you will probably be co-regulating with them for a lot longer than a typical child. So that's kind of an extra load on you for a lot longer as a parent, and that can take its toll. So you got to take care of yourself, like big time. And I know that we're crap at doing that as parents, but this has actually got to be a priority. And the sooner you do this, in your parenting journey, the better you're going to be. And I wish I had known this 5-10 years ago, and I may have been better at looking after myself than I was, because you just give. But what you need to understand is your gifted child is going to need you in ways for longer than a typical child. And a lot of it has to do with that emotional regulation, which is really exhausting, can be really full on. Helping them to emotionally regulate and having tools and strategies to, work that through as a family. So be kind to yourself. Make time for yourself to fill your own cup, to rest. And ultimately, this journey of parenting gifted kids can be really full on and hard. But my number one advice to you is have fun. Have fun and laugh as much as you can as a family, because that will help you get through those really difficult times. Those bonds from the lightness and the funness and the laughter will help you in the hard times. Because ultimately, if we look to the future, I think as parents, all we really want is to have children who grow up to be adults who are confident, who know who they are, who have some resilience, who are doing something they love with, loved ones that are healthy relationships, right? And so what do we need to do now as parents to help our children become those adults? And it's these key things. We need to understand who they are and have realistic expectations. They need an appropriate education. We need them to help find their happy place in terms of their mental health and their social environment. They need like-minded peers to share time with. You need to be able to see yourself in others, and gifted kids need that as well. Otherwise, they will always think that they're the odd one out. And we need to get through this journey together as a family without any of us burning out, the kids or the adults. And to do that, we need lots of fun and lots of laughter. And that can be really difficult when things are so stressful. But I would say they're the times where even more we need to, stop and kind of ask ourselves, well, what do we have control over and what don't we have control over? And the reality is we have control over what we do on the weekends, some of us, if we're not working, or in the evenings. And how can we make that fun? How can we make those times that kind of image we had as a family? Maybe for you, it's playing board games together as a family. Maybe it's going for a walk or down the beach. Maybe it's just Sometimes we put on a YouTube playlist and we'll just sit there and have a laugh at funny cats and educational things, but also just funny things on YouTube. And it's just about having a bit of time out and laughing, whatever that is. I would say don't forget to laugh. Don't forget that your kids are still kids. It's okay if they just play in the mud. Like, it can feel really stressful to be parenting gifted kids. So, I don't know, is that helpful? I think that would have helped me 5 years ago. These are some of the big things I have learnt. I hope that that is helpful for you and I haven't just been kind of ranting at you for a while. When I do these podcasts where it's just me talking, I actually just get to the end and I'm like, oh, I just feel like I've been talking too much, which is one of the reasons why I love interviewing people so much. But I hope that there's something in that for you. And you're at the beginning of this journey. It can feel stressful and overwhelming. Do what you need to do to let go of that stress as much as possible. Look after yourself and try and have fun with your kids, because there will be challenges. There are challenges. There are things that are outside of your control, like education and schools, that you've got to try and figure out. There's enough hard things that I think where we have those opportunities to lighten our load, we should take those opportunities. And that was advice I could have done with 5 years ago, because right now I'm feeling a bit burnt out still. And I'm kind of like, okay, being kind to myself now, but it's probably, I should have started this a whole lot sooner. So take care. I hope that's good. Tomorrow's episode is actually talking to grandparents about grandparenting gifted kids, which I think will be really interesting and a great conversation. So hopefully I'll see you then. Goodbye.
If you enjoyed this episode and it inspired you in some way, I'd love to hear about your biggest takeaway in the comments. For more episodes, you can subscribe, and to help others find our podcast, please leave a review. You can find show notes and more resources at ourgiftedkids.com, and connect with us on Facebook and Instagram. See you in the same place next week.